Esarhaddon was the king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, ruling from 680 BCE to 669 BCE. Esarhaddon is his English name. In Akkadian, his name is Ashur-ak-Idin, meaning Ashur has given a brother. Esarhaddon was the youngest son of Sennacherib, the previous king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and Nicaea, Sennacherib's second wife. Esarhaddon led the Neo-Assyrian Empire through a golden age, expanding the Neo-Assyrian Empire's territorial holdings, protecting its borders, embarking on a range of building projects, and securing a clean and relatively strife-free succession. Born in 713 BCE, Esarhaddon was likely the only son Sennacherib and Nicaea had. As a child he was ill, often sick, and as a grown man he is described and portrayed as an anxious individual who constantly fretted and pleaded with the gods to tell him what sins he had committed and why the gods were punishing him. During the reign of Esarhaddon's father, Sennacherib, Babylon was in constant revolt against Assyrian overlordship. Babylon was the cultural hub of Mesopotamia and was in consistent revolt to try and overthrow Assyrian rule over southern Mesopotamia and Babylon, enlisting a group known as the Elamites with their king Meroch-Baladan. Sennacherib, in response to this, to try and pacify the Babylonian population, placed his oldest son and heir apparent, Ashur-nadin-Sumi, as king of Babylon in the year 700 BCE. In 694 BCE, Sennacherib attacked the Elamites, who in response attacked Babylon, captured Ashur-nadin-Sumi, and executed him. In response to Ashur-nadin-Sumi's execution, Sennacherib sacked Babylon, destroying temples, palaces, and driving out the population. This left Sennacherib without a viable heir. Sennacherib selected Esarhaddon to be the new crown prince, likely due to his mother's influence over Sennacherib. But Esarhaddon had many brothers, who were increasingly jealous of his position as crown prince. Esarhaddon, understanding this, fled west for his safety, to the city of Haran. This gave his brothers the opportunity to seize the throne from under him, and in doing so, costing the life of Esarhaddon's father. In 681 BCE, Sennacherib was assassinated by either one or more of his sons. One of the assassins was likely Esarhaddon's elder brother, Urad-Musilu, and Esarhaddon, on hearing of his father's death, raised an army and marched to Ashur to seize his throne. Along the way, he met his brother's army, who had been sent to stop him. But the army, on seeing Esarhaddon, quickly deserted the enemy and joined Esarhaddon, who then marched at full strength to the capital of Ashur, where he then ascended to the throne. The civil war took only 2 months, and many of the brothers fled from Assyria to neighbouring countries. These brothers would prove a thorn in the side of Esarhaddon for many years, but during his rule he would crush them. The Akkadian calendar starts in March. Therefore, 1 year in Assyria took place over 2 years in our modern day calendar. To counter this, instead of using multiple dates, I'm usually just going to stick with BCE, or I will just reference what year of Esarhaddon's reign the event occurred in. Esarhaddon's first year can be characterized by challenges and revolts. Firstly, there was a large-scale Chaldean revolt led by Chaldean tribesmen supported by Elamites in southern Mesopotamia. Esarhaddon sent his army south and crushed those forces in 680 BCE. The Babylonians were also in uproar, as was much of southern Mesopotamia. Sennacherib had sacked Babylon in response to the Elamites executing Ashur-nadin-Sumi. Unlike his grandfather, father, and even his son, Esarhaddon can be characterized by his excellent relationship with the Babylonians. In 680, Esarhaddon announced a rebuilding of Babylon, better and bigger than ever. In Babylonia, Esarhaddon was presented as the legitimate Babylonian ruler, not an Assyrian one, enacting Babylonian royal rituals, using Babylonian royal titles, and claiming that he was made king by the Babylonian gods, such as Marduk. Esarhaddon's Babylonian policy was a critical success. The Babylonians, when controlled by the Assyrians, were almost constantly in rebellion. The fact that Esarhaddon was able to have 28 years of peace between Assyria and Babylonia because of his policies shows how effective of a ruler he was. Esarhaddon was able to maintain control of Babylonia without conducting any full-scale military campaigns against the Babylonians themselves. Esarhaddon spent the majority of 679 BCE securing the empire's borders. Esarhaddon went to war against the Manneans of western Iran. He sacked the city of Arza, known as Tel Gema, near the borders of Egypt, and went to battle against the Cimmerians, a nomadic people from beyond the Caucasus who were raiding and plundering in Sicilia. In 677 BCE, the cities of Kundu and Sisu in Sicilia and the famous Phoenician trading city of Sidon rose up against Esarhaddon. Esarhaddon went to war with these cities and sacked and destroyed them. Kundu and Sisu were both sacked, while Sidon was completely destroyed, the first time this had ever happened to such a wealthy Phoenician trading city. On top of the ruins of Sidon, Esarhaddon built a new city known as Kar Esarhaddon, which became the new hub of commerce, trade, and Assyrian administration in the Phoenician coast. In 676 BCE, Esarhaddon came into conflict with the Arabs of the Syrian desert. A client king of Esarhaddon, Yatha, had been overthrown by a man named Wabu. Esarhaddon sent an army in to sack Arab settlements and restore Yatha to the throne. An inscription reads, "I, Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, king of the four corners, who loves righteousness and to whom lie is repugnant, sent my army to help Yatha. They conquered the whole of Arubu and put Wabu and those who were with him in chains and brought them to me. I put a neck chain on them and tied them at my gate." In the winter of 673 BCE, at the end of Esarhaddon's 7th year, an Assyrian army went out to conquer Egypt. The campaign ended in what was probably one of Assyria's worst defeats in history. Esarhaddon was defeated, his army routed, and he was pushed back into Assyrian territory. Yet, even though suffering this great defeat, he would return 2 years later to conquer Egypt. For Esarhaddon to reach Egypt, he had to cross through the Sinai Desert, a dry and arid peninsula separating Egypt from the Levant. We can see that many of his previous conquests were leading up to this first invasion, the sacking of Arza, the pacification of the Arab tribes, all to help him move through the Sinai Desert. There was still a danger though. The Sinai Desert had no reliable water supplies, and an army, if it lost a battle, with the desert to its rear, would have nowhere to flee. This is what we assume happened to Esarhaddon's first invasion of Egypt. It was a major military disaster. A few months later, Esarhaddon would launch an invasion and conquer a small mountain kingdom known as Shubira, which had been harboring one of his brothers, Urad Musilu. Esarhaddon devastated Shubira. He laid siege to the capital of Upume. This shows how effective the Neo-Assyrian Empire was under Esarhaddon. After losing a major military campaign, they were quickly able to recover, invade their enemies, and within 14 to 16 months later, Esarhaddon had led a second invasion of Egypt. In 672 BCE, Esarhaddon laid siege to the city of Tyre and came to an agreement with its ruler, Baal. From 672 to 670, the Medes, Manneans, Scythians, and other peoples rose up in rebellion against the Assyrians, but they were eventually defeated. In 672, another vital event took place in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the vassal treaties of Esarhaddon. These treaties stated that Esarhaddon's sons would take command of different parts of the empire. Ashurbanipal would be granted Assyria, and Esarhaddon's other son, Shamash Sham Ukin, would be given Babylon under the subservience of Ashurbanipal. Esarhaddon summoned all his loyal vassals to swear oaths of fealty to the vassal treaties to him and to his sons, binding them to support his son and support the succession treaties after his death. In 671 BCE, Esarhaddon led a second invasion of Egypt. This time, it was successful. At the time, Egypt was ruled by the 25th dynasty, also known as the Nubian dynasty, whose pharaoh was a man named Tirhakah. Tirhakah had risen to power in the 690s, while Sennacherib was dealing with Babylon, and was able to exploit many of the western trade routes through Egypt to Assyria, cutting off the vital trade lines. The Egyptians were defeated by the Assyrians in 3 key battles, all fought on the 3rd, 16th, and 18th of the Assyrian month of Du'uzu, which we know as around June-July. On the 22nd of July, 671 BCE, Esarhaddon sacked Memphis, carrying off huge amounts of booty and forcing the royal family into exile. He then headed south and sacked the city of Thebes, but was unable to hold it. Esarhaddon controlled Lower Egypt, the Egyptian Delta, and Memphis, but was unable to push into Upper Egypt. In 669, Egypt and the city of Tyre revolted, and on his way to invade Egypt for a third and final time, Esarhaddon died. He ruled for 12 years, from 681 to 669 BCE, and ruled over Syria at its height. He was succeeded by his son Ashurbanipal, who would be the last king of any real consequence in the Neo-Assyrian Empire before its collapse. Under Esarhaddon's rule, large-scale building activities took place across the Neo-Assyrian Empire, not only in Assyria and Babylon, but also in foreign lands conquered by him. Places such as Arbela, Kalhu, Nineveh, Tarbusu, Ashur, Babylon, Borsippa, Nippur, and Uruk, and a range of other places, saw large-scale urban renewal and building activities take place. For example, Babylon saw a large-scale rejuvenation, with new temples being built, waterworks, houses, orchards, canals, walls, and dilapidated sections being removed. Royal residences were built in Assyrian cities of Ashur, Kalhu, Nineveh, Tarbusu, as well as a huge range of temples. For example, the Esagil, the Temple of Marduk, the Ziggurat Etemenaki, the Temple of Nabu in Babylon, Azida. In Nippur, Esarhaddon worked on the Temple of the Queen of Nippur, Ebara-Dugara, and Ekur, the Temple of Enlil. Ayana, the Temple of Ishtar in Uruk, the Temple of Egaskam Kala in Arbela, as well as a range of temples and shrines to the main Assyrian god Ashur, such as Asara, which was the temple of Ashur in the city of Ashur. The city was named after the god. Esarhaddon led the Neo-Assyrian Empire through a golden age. After his death, his son Ashurbanipal took power, who then, after Ashurbanipal's death, the empire quickly fell to a coalition of Egyptians, Medes, Babylonians, and other peoples. Esarhaddon led the Neo-Assyrian Empire during a time where it was the most feared and powerful nation on the entire planet. Esarhaddon was the most important ruler of that era. Esarhaddon was the penultimate ruler of probably the most important, feared, wealthy, and powerful empire in the ancient Near East at that point. Nothing would come close to rivaling it until the Persians a few years later. Esarhaddon gets pitied a bit by scholars, as he is seen not in these great conquering terms like his father or like the end of the empire like his son. Esarhaddon gets brushed over a bit. He's seen as impetuous, as a bit vain, but mostly as very anxious, unsure about his rulership. But I don't think that's fair. I think he really shows his qualities as a king, as a ruler. He's ambitious. He conquers Egypt, one of the most powerful kingdoms throughout the ancient Near East, and a really old rival of Assyria, accomplishing something that his ancestors never could really have dreamed of. I think it's important that we recognize Esarhaddon as one of the key rulers of not just the Sargonid dynasty, which was the period that Esarhaddon ruled, but of all of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. His building projects have left their mark, his wars were important and strengthened the empire, and most vitally, especially for you and me, he left behind a wide variety of primary sources, texts, writings that we learn from and we read from, and we're pretty blessed to have 2,500 years later. So, thank you so much for watching Huge History, guys. I've been Jordan. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.